Hi guys, welcome to September's dispatches. We've just got over a rather large typhoon that hit Hong Kong directly, and that's one of the reasons dispatches are a couple of days late, because we lost 2 working days due to the typhoon. But apart from that, here we are today with another few selections. But before we get into the selections themselves, just a little other note. In a couple of weeks' time, I'll be almost ready to fly out to the States. I'm actually coming to the Chicagoland show, which has taken over from the old and much lamented Chicago Toy Soldier Show. Now, Chicagoland show is being run, I believe, at the Schaumburg Marriott, which is not that far from the Hyatt Regency Woodfield where the old show was. But the new show is being organised and run by our good friend Matt Murphy of Hobby Bunker. I'm going along this time, not to display, not to take a room or anything like that. I'm going along for a look-see, just to see what everyone else is up to meet lots of old friends, and also just to see the lie of the land. One of the reasons that we're not taking part in this particular year's show, or another very good reason, is the sheer cost of shipping all of our dioramas and displays, which we did in the past, over to Chicago for the show. In the good old days, this was never cheap, but it was nowhere near as expensive as it is now. So I thought it'd be a good idea to go, by all means, go along, support Matt and the dealers and collectors that are taking part. But just to see for myself what the new show's like, what the new hotel's like, and hopefully I'll meet some of you guys there. So I'll be arriving, I think, on Thursday, the 21st of September. Hopefully there'll be a little bit of room trading going on, and then of course the main show is being held on Sunday, the 24th. I'll be staying all the way through to see the main show on the Sunday. After that, I'm going down to San Antonio, Texas, and I'll be with the King and Country store in Texas for the next 7 or 8 days. And we're hoping to have a little gathering of collectors down there. So if any of you are in the Texas area or feel like coming into Texas to see our event, we're hoping to do something on the 28th of September, Thursday the 28th of September. So look out for more details. I'll give you more as things develop. But in the meantime, let's see what we've got this month. The big news this month is these 2 tanks you see in front of you. This is the famous M48A3 main battle tank, which was the mainstay piece of armour for the American forces in Vietnam during the war. They were also supplied in some numbers to the South Vietnamese as well. But the actual planning of this tank went all the way back to the aftermath of World War II. America was still very much well supplied with thousands of M4 Shermans and lots of different Geises, the M26 Pershings. They even had the M47s, the M41s, but they still felt a need for a main feature battle tank. So in 1952, they brought out the initial M48 design. It was quite a heavy tank, but of course its important thing was it had a 90mm gun, which is one of the best tank guns around at the time. So the M41A1 and A2s, those served from that point until the late 50s, at which point they were superseded by the M48A3, much improved, much more reliable, and that's what saw most of the service in Vietnam. And that's of course what we've depicted here. We've actually produced 2 US Marine Corps M48s. The call signs are Charlie 44 and Charlie 41. They both get nicknames. One is Mad Dogs, the other is Witch Bitch. So you've got a choice. And each of the models comes with the full body tank commander and in here a little head and shoulders figure of the tank driver. It's a fantastic model. It's one I've wanted to do for a long time, and finally we get round to doing it. If you're into our Vietnam figures, I think you'll have to agree that this is one of the finest tanks that we've ever done. It's a great model, lots of nice extra detailing on the back, excuse me, with lots of add-on extra equipment, and even the little 50 caliber machine gun in the turret opens up, and the commander's hatch can close or open as you prefer. By the way, you'll notice that the tank commander is carrying the little CAR-15 carbine, which obviously shortened M16, but much easier to use or to carry in and around a big tank like this. So, two different versions available. Both come in a terrific full color presentation box. They'll be available from mid-September, and as I say, if you're into Vietnam, I'm sure you'll want these as well. Now, perched on the back of this little tank here is this little lady. This is actually a Viet Cong girl. We actually meant to release this figure several months before, when we released the little sampan with the sitting and kneeling Viet Cong. Unfortunately, she wasn't quite ready at that point, so we had to delay her release. Anyway, this little Viet Cong lady is carrying the M2 carbine. Now again, for those of you that enjoy weaponry and what have you, for the South Vietnamese, or the Vietnamese generally, it was much easier to use something like an M1 or an M2 carbine as opposed to the big, heavy M1 Garand, which had been supplied to the South Vietnamese forces by America in the early part of the war. Quite a lot of these M1, M2 carbines were captured by the Viet Cong, and they were a favourite weapon for female members of the VC. So this young lady is sitting down, holding her M2 carbine, and she'll be available at the same time as the tank. Leaving those tanks, behind for a moment, we'll come up here onto the roadway. Here what you have is a group of mostly second generation Waffen SS in action sets. One of the great things about King Country is over the years we've built up quite a back catalogue of terrific figures, most of which of course are no longer available. And sometimes you'll see some of these figures going on the secondary market at ridiculous prices. Now of course I always like to see anybody get a return on their investment, but at the same time we've also had collectors saying to us, I really, I wish I could get those figures. I really like the figures, but I don't want to have to pay some of the prices that I see on eBay. So we talked about it and we thought, well look, let's pick out some of the best that we think are not in our present inventory and would be really useful to all those collectors that have joined us since these ones were first released. So what we've got here is actually different 3- and 2-man groups, and even a little single figure at the end. Now we have got 2 brand new Waffen SS figures among these other second generation. And we call them second generation because in my view, and I think the view of their creative team here, these are actually much better painted and more realistically painted than the original ones, and they're still terrific figures. Now, if you look at most of these figures, you'll see that almost all of the second generation ones date from the period of 1942-43, particularly Eastern Front, although you can use them in Western Front as well. But the style of still wearing the jack boots kind of dates it to early to mid-war period. Up here, the little 2-figure set I've mentioned earlier. We've got one rifleman, and the other guy is carrying the PPSH, I think it's PPHS submachine gun, which was a standard Russian submachine gun. I watched a great video on YouTube the other day of a guy firing one of these, and of course that Russian submachine gun was widely issued to the Soviet troops, and quite a few of them fell into German hands as well, and it gave the Germans extra firepower, so that's why some of them adopted the weapon. Next to those guys is 3 little winter figures. Now these are all basically spring, summer and autumn, but the 3 guys here are winter, and we've got one winter scout which will go very well with our recently released Battle of the Bulge figures. He's got a greatcoat on, but on the top of his greatcoat he's got the white winter smock on top. Great little figure, and he's carrying the late war MP44. Next to him are 2 dismounted tank crew, and again can be used on the Eastern Front in the winter, or can be used obviously at Battle of the Bulge. You could say they're having a smoke and coffee break, and I'm assuming that if you take it as Battle of the Bulge, maybe the coffee that they're drinking might be real American coffee that they've captured. I mean, one of the guys is pouring himself a cup of coffee, the other guy is having a quick cigarette. That might be American as well, part of the booty that they captured in Battle of the Bulge. And at the very end, we've got that single walking Waffen SS officer. All of these figures are going to go very well with our soon-to-be released Kursk Tiger tanks. They'll be coming up very shortly. So if you've got these infantry, they'll go really well with those Kursk Tigers. Now, let's go for something completely different, away from the Vietnam War, away from World War II, right to the back here. As virtually everyone knows, King & Country is a Hong Kong-based company. King & Country's been going for 40 years. I've lived and worked in Hong Kong for the last 46 years. It's the most amazing place, an incredible city. As I've mentioned many times before, full of very intelligent, hard-working people. I like to think maybe I'm one of them, but anyway, the local population is 95% Chinese. And a few months ago, I went to an exhibition in Hong Kong, and it was actually some enthusiasts that had made fantastic model buildings, typical of the kind of buildings you used to see all over Hong Kong, especially in the 1950s, the 1960s, and even into the 1970s when I arrived. And these buildings were in roughly 1/24 scale detail, but full of animation and full of everything except one thing. There was no figures. And it got me thinking about that whole period of the history of Hong Kong, and especially that period in the 1960s where Hong Kong really started to boom. But still there was a lot of street life in Hong Kong, and you know, some of it still exists, but sadly it's fast disappearing into among all the skyscrapers and high rises that you see all over this city. But back in those days, many of the houses were 3- and 4-story shop houses, where there would be a shop on the bottom and there'd be accommodation on the floors above. So taking that as the theme, I started to look back at photographic references of that period of life in Hong Kong, and decided to come up with a series, a sub-series of Streets of Old Hong Kong that's called Hong Kong, All Our Yesterdays, kind of like the day before yesterday. So it's still in the relatively recent past. And of course, in those days, people almost lived on the streets. They lived in very cramped accommodation. So a lot of things that went on were down at street level. So here's the first few releases of what I think will be quite a big series. Now, going from left to right here, right at the end here is a nice young lady wearing a traditional Chinese cheongsam, which was you used to see much more commonly in those days than you would see today. But anyway, very brightly, gaily coloured, and she's even holding a paper fan. So I'm assuming it's sometime in the summer or spring. Next to her here, we've even got a little set that's a street hawker. Now, street hawkers were people that couldn't afford an actual shop, but took everything they had to sell and put it on a mat in the street for everybody to walk past. So obviously rent cost nothing. And again, these guys would sell, and women would sell everything under the sun, from second-hand goods that some people might class as junk, to brand new goods, or things that people had sold because they needed the money, or even things that had fallen off the back of a truck, if you take my meaning. Anyway, this guy's got a selection of all kinds of bits and bobs that he's selling, and it looks like he's studying an early transistor radio to see how much that's worth. Next to him is a gentleman just standing smoking, and again, back in those days, smoking was not seen as the unhealthy habit that it is today, and it was still quite common to see most men in those days smoking. Very rare to see a Chinese woman, smoking in the street. That was thought to be very low class. Next to them is this guy here, who is a traditional coolie. Now, the word coolie, spelled C-O-O-L-I-E, is really a man who did manual labour, usually delivering goods from point A to point B, obviously by hand. And you would see these guys, and occasionally you can still see someone like this carrying large baskets strung over a bamboo piece of wood, carrying food, all kinds of fruit, vegetables, goods, you name it, they would deliver it. So that's this guy here. This little group here are all individuals, but they're all newspaper readers. Again, before the internet, before the iPhone, before the mobile phone, people got most of their news from the newspapers. And in Hong Kong, in those days, there was lots and lots of Chinese newspapers. So these guys here are reading what's happening in the world on their newspaper. And at the very end here is another guy who's just looking over their shoulder to see what they're reading. As I say, this is just the very first batch. We've got a lot more in the pipeline. Another factor that these figures can be used for is not just for Hong Kong. If you know anything about Asia, you'll know that in all of the countries around Asia, there are fairly large ethnic Chinese communities. These are people that immigrated or moved to Indonesia, Malaysia. Singapore's the best example. I'm also thinking of Vietnam and all over Asia, in fact, have got large communities of Chinese people. And again, they've settled down there, they've had their families there, they're part of the overall country, but they're obviously very, very much involved in the day-to-day operations of those countries. And mostly they would live in the towns and cities. One of the places that one of the largest communities of ethnic Chinese was, of course, South Vietnam. And in those days, if you visited Saigon, Hue, Da Nang, any of the major towns and cities throughout South Vietnam, you would find entire areas that were almost exclusively Chinese. So these figures that you see here can also be used in any Vietnamese street scene, especially if you collect our Vietnam series. Some of these, if not all of these, would make useful additions if you're building up a street scene typical of South Vietnam during the time of the war. So that's all of those, all our yesterday's guys. You'll also see we've produced special illustrated boxes for this series as well. So look out for those. And finally, look out for that big box there, which is going to contain one of the M48 A3 battle tanks. And if you don't see any of that, look out for me at the Chicagoland show. I'll be there from Thursday, the 21st of September, through till Sunday, the 24th. And then after that, I'll be down in Texas, in San Antonio, at King Country, Texas. So hope to see some of you at one or more of those places. But in the meantime, that's the story for September. Hope there's something for you. Thanks again.